This is an overview of a draft strategy map that we developed for Oman Gas Company based on the materials that we were provided. Now, it's important to note that we weren't provided with all of your strategy documents, and the documents we were provided with were not intended for this purpose. So it's likely that many of the things I'll be revealing here are not precisely correct. But the purpose of this presentation is to show you the world of the potential, what we can do with the sorts of materials that were provided in aid of strategy execution. So, overall, we describe our strategy at Oman Gas in 4 perspectives. What do we do towards value creation? And in order to create value, it's important that we meet our stakeholders' and customers' needs. Now, to meet those stakeholder and customer needs, we actually have to achieve operational excellence in the areas that matter to them. And then underpinning all of this are the people and how we develop our competencies and culture to build and maintain these processes, to meet our customer requirements, to achieve what our investors and stakeholders require of us. So if we take our existing strategy documents, for example, our vision, we'll put that on the top of our strategy map, be the regional champion in energy infrastructure with a global presence. So how are we going to get there? Well, we've identified 3 significant goals. First, we need to build our position as reference gas operator. So that's something we need to do to meet our stakeholder requirements. So I've plunked that objective in the stakeholder perspective. Secondly, we need to diversify our energy markets. Again, that's something that we need to do in order to achieve value creation. And it talks about stable revenues, another financial strategic objective. And then we have to capture growth opportunities internationally. So again, it's important to note we're not inventing anything here. These are the objectives that leadership team has reviewed and approved, and we're just putting those into context. So if we take a look at the gas pillar, it talks about how we need to strengthen our role, which we've talked on. Secondly, consolidating the gas transmission network. So consolidating network assets is actually an element of operational excellence. It's a thing that we need to do internally to achieve success. It talks about operational excellence and our pursuit of that. So again, another operational excellence objective. If I take a look at the power pillar, it talks about adding new power generation. So adding capacity is something that we need to do to meet stakeholder needs. Talks about leveraging steady returns. Well, we've already got that under produce stable revenues. So that's a duplicate objective. Then it talks about acquiring skills to develop expertise. And again, that's a people development objective. Now, if we take a look at the oil pillar, it talks about building an integrated oil logistics company by consolidating network assets, another objective that we already had. Acquiring skills, which is another objective we've already discovered. And then lastly, leveraging on international partners. So that's a people development, strategic asset at the bottom of the strategy map. Now, if we take a look at the strategic objectives over the next 5 years, some of these are new. So for example, increased profitability and returns. So we'll put that as a financial, increased profitability. Then others are just key indicators next to other objectives that we already have, such as increased sectorial diversification revenue, increased foreign presence and revenues. So we got those objectives already. Then it talks about enhancing customer relationship management. That's something new. Again, that's an internal activity. We have to go out there and do activities specifically around enhancing our customer and stakeholder relationship management. It talks about developing a strong corporate culture. So this is the collection of the key strategic objectives that we surfaced from your existing strategy document. The next step in a strategy map is to show the cause and effect relationship. So these objectives are done in aid of overall strategic success. So for example, to increase profitability, there's three things we need to do. First, we need to diversify into other energy markets. And if we diversify, that will help increase profitability. Second, we need to become that reference operator, which in turn will increase profitability. And thirdly, we need to produce stable revenues. And again, that will help us increase profitability. Now, as we become the reference operator, that in fact is going to help us diversify into energy markets because we are that operator, and it will enable us to generate stable revenues. So we're using these arrows to show that cause and effect relationship. In fact, some people argue the arrows are more important than the objectives, because if we're not achieving those flows of the arrows, we will not achieve overall success. So, how to become that reference operator? Well, the primary thing is to enhance our stakeholder and customer relationships. As we understand our stakeholder, that will help us become the reference operator. And in a couple of ways, not only directly, but if we understand what our customers and stakeholders want, that will help us pursue operational excellence, which in turn will help us capture the international growth opportunities, and in turn, that will feed our ability to diversify into other energy markets. Now, if we do get this operational excellence, that's also going to underpin us becoming the reference operator. Now, on the right-hand side, enhancing customer relationship management underpins our consolidation because we now know where we need to get consolidated based on what our stakeholders and customers are looking for. Now, the consolidated network assets, of course, allow us to add new capacity economically, which in turn allows us to generate stable returns. And that new capacity also allows us to become the reference operator. And then finally, underpinning all of this are the enablers of acquiring skills and developing expertise, developing a strong culture, and leveraging those international partners. These things support everything above it. So this is called a strategy map. It outlines the key strategic objectives. And again, it's important to note, these are things that the executive has already debated, discussed, and agreed. Now, the next step is we need to prioritize these. These objectives are not all equally important. Now, we expect these objectives will transcend time. They'll be here this year, next year, and the following year, but the weighting will change over time. As we achieve objectives and new opportunities pop up, the weighting shifts. But for now, we'll add in this illustrative weighting. Now, the weighting, like the strategy map, really needs to be created by the executive team. But this is sort of a proxy for the weightings. So you can see that we have some core strategic objectives which have a weighting above 10% and some that are not the focus of this year. So there are two dominant themes in this hypothetical weighting which talk about how we're dealing with our people and how we are getting operationally excellent, because they have a weighting of over 10%. So in fact, if you take a look at the two objectives related to human capital, developing the competencies and developing the culture, that amounts to 25% of this year's focus. And these three, if we group them together, is about operational excellence and gaining that capacity. And that represents 40% of our strategy. So our core theme is about grabbing that capacity. And we're grabbing it both by operational excellence and building up the strength of our human resources. Now, this isn't necessarily the themes for this year, but this is how we could interpret that prioritization as we communicate it to the rest of the organization. Now, the next step is actually looking at those KPIs. And so the workshop we've just completed is we've taken a look at each of the business units and identified their KPIs across those four perspectives. Now, obviously, it's a bit hard to read the spreadsheet, but if we take a look at, for example, the operating business units, we can see that under value creation, we've identified KPIs in the category of budget adherence, revenue, cost savings, and other key financial measures, and identified what we would have at each of the business units. Now, what we should be able to do is take that strategy map and begin figuring out which of those KPIs help us report against each one. So obviously, profitability has the metrics of net profit and cost savings. Producing stable returns is about that RAB implementation. Maybe adding new capacity, we would take a look at the capacity that we added last year, plus whatever the projects are for this year. So in this way, we can begin to discover what are the KPIs which we want to make available to the organization on a monthly basis to show how we're progressing against those strategic objectives. Some of these are existing processes and some are projects. Now, at the corporate level, we may be taking aggregate corporate metrics. We may be indexing a series of metrics that come from the business units and weighting them for the roll-up. But the important thing to note is, again, we're already collecting the data. We are just now putting it into strategic context. Now, to provide a little bit more information about how we do that, think of it this way. If we were to list our strategic objectives down the left side of a spreadsheet and across the top the activities we do. So in this case, we're just looking at the pillars, gas, oil, and power. But in fact, inside of each of these, we could take a look at the processes inside each of those business units, or even each of the directorates. In this case, at the more aggregate level, what we can do is score the impact of the gas business unit on our ability to increase profitability or diversify into the energy market and so forth. So it looks a bit like this. Here, let's take a look at this cell here. So here we're multiplying the weighting by the impact. So 5 times 5. This cell is worth 25 strategy points. If you come over here, we're multiplying the weighting, 5, times the impact is only 2. So it's a less of an impact, and therefore it's 5 times 2, or 10. Over here, we have even a higher impact. So it's a weighting of 15, an impact of 5, which means this is worth 45 strategy points. So these cells are the multiplication of the impact times the strategic importance. So obviously, the higher impact we have on something of higher strategic importance, the more critical that is to Oman Gas's overall success. So the black cells show the critical performance nodes, the dark gray, less critical but important, and then the light gray, that third level. Now, this helps us in a number of ways. So for example, if we're looking for drill down KPIs, those black ones are the critical KPIs that we have to have. If I owned this process, I could figure out where I need to prioritize. Let's take a look at that. So these are the points for gas. Now I can see that if I'm trying to manage my time, these 3 points are worth 75. So these are the most critical activities. Then I've got a couple at 50, 3 at 25, and then 1 at 10. So the idea is I can prioritize my time, my efforts, my resources in line to what's strategically important to the organization. It also means that if I look at all of my processes, I can look horizontally and figure out where the important performance nodes are and how important they are. So this allows me to run my company, my department, my process. It allows me to figure out who the natural teams are horizontally for delivering strategy. Helps me figure out where are the KPIs that I need in order to give leadership an effective portfolio of KPIs for managing the business. So if we look at any one of these nodes, we can begin to sort out the specific metrics for that business unit impacting that particular strategic objective. So this has just been a quick overview of how we can capture and consolidate the existing Oman Gas strategy, consolidate that and report back to it against the existing KPIs, and then begin building drill downs to the processes and projects in which people work at to effectively allow individuals and teams to manage their performance in line with our overall strategic goals. Now, it's important to note that the numbers and the strategy maps and so forth in this presentation are hypothetical. The correct way to do this is to meet with the executive team and build their version of the strategy map, work with them to determine their weightings for the current year, and then link those back to the existing KPIs, and then use process owners and participants to scale and score that ontology, the linkage of processes back to strategic objectives, and identify those black, gray, light gray squares. We hope this has been informative to you and look forward to continuing this conversation.